Theranos was an American privately held corporation that was touted as a breakthrough health technology company. The company claimed that it devised blood tests that required very small amounts of blood and could be performed rapidly thanks to the small automated devices the company had developed. However, these claims were later proven to be false. Founded in 2003 by 19-year-old Elizabeth Holmes, Theranos raised more than $700 million from venture capitalists and private investors, resulting in a $10 billion valuation at its peak in 2013 and 2014. A turning point came in 2015 when medical research professor John Ioannidis and later Eleftherios Diamandis, along with investigative journalist John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal, questioned the validity of Theranos' technology. The company faced a string of legal and commercial challenges from medical authorities, investors, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC), Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services (CMS), state attorneys general, former business partners, patients, and others. By June 2016, it was estimated that Holmes' personal net worth had dropped from $4.5 billion to virtually nothing. After several years of struggle, lawsuits, and sanctions from CMS, what remained of the company was dissolved on September 4, 2018. On March 14, 2018, Theranos, Holmes, and former company president Ramesh Sunny Balwani were charged with fraud by the SEC. On June 15, 2018, the United States Attorney for the Northern District of California announced the indictment of Holmes on wire fraud and conspiracy charges. Balwani was also indicted on the same charges. The trial was scheduled to commence in August 2020, but it was delayed due to the COVID-19 pandemic and Holmes' pregnancy. Holmes' trial began on August 31, 2021. While at Stanford University, Elizabeth Holmes had an idea to develop a wearable patch that could adjust the dosage of drug delivery and notify doctors of variables in patients' blood. She started developing lab-on-a-chip technology for blood tests with the idea to start a company that would make blood tests cheaper, more convenient and accessible to consumers. Holmes dropped out of Stanford in 2003 and used the education trust from her parents to found the company that would later be called Theranos, derived from a combination of the words therapy and diagnosis. The company's original name was Real-Time Cures, which Holmes changed after deciding that too many people were skeptical of the word cure. In 2012, Safeway invested $350 million into retrofitting 800 locations with clinics that would offer in-store blood tests. However, after many missed deadlines and questionable results from a trial clinic at Safeway's corporate offices, the deal was called off in 2015. In 2013, Theranos partnered with Walgreens to offer in-store blood tests at more than 40 locations. Although Theranos blood tests were reportedly used on drug trial patients for GlaxoSmithKline and Pfizer, both companies stated that there were no active projects with Theranos in October 2015. In November 2016, Walgreens Company filed suit against Theranos in a federal court in Delaware for breach of contract. In June 2017, Theranos reported to investors that the suit, which originally sought $140 million in damages, was settled for less than $30 million. In March 2015, the Cleveland Clinic announced a partnership with Theranos in order to test its technology and decrease the cost of lab tests. In July 2015, Theranos became the lab work provider for Pennsylvania insurers AmeriHealth Caritas and Capital Blue Cross. In July 2015, the Food and Drug Administration approved the use of the company's fingerstick blood testing device for the herpes simplex virus, HSV-1, outside a clinical laboratory setting. In February 2015, Stanford professor John Ioannidis wrote in the Journal of the American Medical Association that no peer-reviewed research from Theranos had been published in medical research literature. 3839 In May 2015, University of Toronto professor Eleftherios Diamandis analyzed Theranos' technology and concluded that most of the company's claims are exaggerated. Attempting to boost the company's credibility, Holmes invited then U.S. Vice President Joe Biden to tour their facility. Biden praised what he saw, but in order to conceal the lab's true operating conditions, Holmes and Balwani had created a fake lab for the vice president's tour. In October 2015, John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal reported that Theranos was using traditional blood testing machines instead of the company's Edison devices to run its tests, and that the company's Edison machines might provide inaccurate results. Tyler Schultz, a Theranos employee from 2013 to 2014, and the grandson of then Theranos director, former U.S. Secretary of State George P. Shultz, was a key source for the WSJ story. Schultz had attempted to bring his concerns to company management, and when that had failed, he had spoken to Carrero and also, under an alias, reported the company to the New York State Department of Health. Theranos claimed that the allegations were factually and scientifically erroneous. Walgreens suspended plans to expand blood testing centers in their stores following the report. At that time, the Cleveland Clinic announced that it would work to verify Theranos' technology. Theranos fought back against the journal's investigation, sending lawyers after sources in the story, including Schultz, in an effort to stop them from providing information to the press. Former employees of reputation management firm Status Labs said that Theranos had hired the firm to discreetly erase mentions of the WSJ's reporting from its Wikipedia article, despite the activity being a violation of the website's terms of use. Following the WSJ story, the history of FDA interactions with Theranos was scrutinized. The FDA had received a formal inquiry to look at Theranos' blood test devices by the U.S. Department of Defense in 2012, before the devices were commercially available, and did not require FDA approval. FDA inspection reports from 2014 and 2015 stated that its containers for blood collection were not validated under actual or simulated use conditions and were not reviewed and not approved by designated individuals prior to issuance. In 2015, an FDA inspection resulted in multiple observed violations of FDA Title 21 regulations. It was eventually revealed that the FDA had classified Theranos' device, called an anatoner, as a Class II medical device, meaning that Theranos would need to use special labels, meet certain performance standards and perform post-market surveillance of the device. Theranos asserted that the anatoner was a Class I medical device and therefore was not subject to any regulatory requirements. After the 2015 inspection, Theranos announced that it would voluntarily suspend its tests apart from the FDA-approved herpes simplex virus, HSV-1. The Arizona Department of Health Services reported issues with the company's Scottsdale lab meeting regulations in September 2015. The reports were revealed in the Arizona Republic in November 2015. In January 2016, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services (CMS) sent a letter to Theranos based on an inspection of its Newark, California lab in 2015, reporting that the facility caused immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety due to a test to determine the correct dose of the blood-thinning drug warfarin. In 2016, Walgreens and Capital Blue Cross announced a suspension of Theranos' blood tests from the Newark lab. In March 2016, CMS regulators announced plans to enact sanctions that included suspending Holmes and Balwani from owning or operating any certified clinical laboratory for 2 years and that they would revoke the facility's certification as a clinical laboratory. By April 2016, Theranos came under criminal investigation by federal prosecutors and the SEC for allegedly misleading investors and government officials about its technology. The U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce requested information on what Theranos was doing to correct its testing inaccuracies and adherence to federal guidelines in June 2016. In May 2016, Theranos announced that it had voided 2 years of results from its Edison device. The company announced that about 1% of test results had been voided or corrected from its proprietary machines in June 2016. In July 2016, Theranos announced that the CMS had revoked its CLIA certificate and issued sanctions prohibiting its owners and operators from owning or operating a clinical laboratory for 2 years, suspension of approval to receive Medicare and Medicaid payments, and a civil monetary penalty. The company discontinued testing at its Newark location while attempting to resolve the issues. Theranos announced plans to appeal the decision by regulators to revoke its license to operate a lab in California and other sanctions. In August 2016, the company withdrew its request for emergency clearance of a Zika virus blood test after a lack of essential safeguards during the testing process was found by federal inspectors. Theranos announced that it would close its laboratory operations and wellness centers and lay off about 40% of its workforce to work on miniature medical testing machines in October 2016. In January 2017, Theranos announced that it had laid off 41% of its workforce, or approximately 155 people, and closed the last remaining blood testing facility after the lab failed a second major U.S. regulatory inspection. Also, that month, the company faced lawsuits from several different entities including in April 2017, lawyers for Partner Investments LP and 2 other funds, with combined stakes totaling more than $96 million in Theranos preferred shares, charged that Theranos had threatened to seek bankruptcy protection if the investors did not agree to accept additional stock equity in lieu of litigation. Theranos officials said the funds had mischaracterized the exchange offer, which was discussed before the suit was filed. The suit also alleged that Theranos had misled company directors about its practices concerning laboratory testing and that it had secretly bought lab equipment to run fake demonstrations. On May 1, 2017, Theranos announced that it had reached an undisclosed settlement with Partner Fund Management LP, PFM. Theranos General Counsel, David Taylor, stated, "Theranos is pleased to have resolved both lawsuits with PFM. Although we are confident that we would have prevailed at trial, resolution of these two cases allows our tender offer to go forward and enables us to return our focus where it belongs, which is on executing our business plans and delivering value for our shareholders." In April 2017, Theranos reached a settlement with CMS agreeing to stay out of the blood testing business for at least 2 years in exchange for reduced penalties and signed a consent decree with Arizona Attorney General Mark Brnovich over violations of the Arizona Consumer Fraud Act. Alleged violations included false advertisement and inaccurate blood testing. Theranos agreed to refund $4.65 million to the state's residents for Theranos blood testing services, providing a refund to every resident who had received a test, regardless of whether the test results were voided or corrected. In August 2017, Theranos announced it had reached a settlement with Walgreens. In December 2017, Fortress Investment Group, a wholly owned company of SoftBank Group, loaned $100 million to Theranos for 4% of the company. Theranos had reportedly been on the verge of bankruptcy, with the loan meant to keep the company solvent into 2018. The loan was secured by Theranos patents. On April 10, 2018, the company laid off the majority of workers in a renewed bid to avoid bankruptcy. The company's total headcount was down to fewer than 25 employees after having 800 employees at its peak. SoftBank's Fortress bought up Theranos patents and later, taking advantage of the new market conditions in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, set up In March 2018, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission charged Theranos, its CEO Elizabeth Holmes, and former President Ramesh Sunny Balwani, claiming they had engaged in an elaborate, years-long fraud wherein they deceived investors into believing that its key product, a portable blood analyzer, could conduct comprehensive blood tests from finger drops of blood. Holmes reached a settlement with the SEC which required her to pay $500,000, forfeit 19 million shares of company stock, and be barred from having a leadership position in any public company for 10 years. Balwani did not settle with the SEC. On June 15, 2018, Holmes and Balwani were indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. According to the indictment, investors, doctors and patients were defrauded. It is alleged the defendants were aware of the unreliability and inaccuracy of their products but concealed that information. If convicted, they each face a maximum fine of $250,000 and 20 years in prison. The case, United States v. Elizabeth A. Holmes, et al., has been assigned to Lucy H. Coe, United States District Judge of the United States District Court for the Northern District of California. The jury selection for the trial was to begin on July 28, 2020, and the trial was to have commenced in August 2020. However, the COVID-19 pandemic led to a proposed October date before the trial for Holmes was rescheduled to begin on August 31, 2021, with Balwani's trial pushed back further to 2022. In February 2021, federal prosecutors accused Holmes and other executives of destroying evidence in Theranos' final days in business. The specific evidence in question is the history of internal testing, including accuracy and failure rates of Theranos' blood testing systems. On January 3, 2022, Holmes was found guilty of 3 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. On September 4, 2018, Theranos announced in an email to investors that it would cease operations and release its assets and remaining cash to creditors after all efforts to find a buyer came to nothing. Most of the company's remaining employees had been laid off on the previous Friday, August 31. However, Theranos' general counsel and new CEO David Taylor and a few support staffers remained on payroll for a few more days. The Wall Street Journal reported that any equity investments in the company were made worthless by the shutdown.